Okay. All right. We are down to the final topic of the day, and not a moment too soon because I have work here soon. The final topic of the day, I just wanted to watch a YouTube video with you all. If that's okay, I would very much like to watch a YouTube video with everyone. This one is titled... Oh. Let's see. Sorry. Let me fix it. Hang on one second. All right.
Kids in Texas.
Oh my God. I will fix it. It is fixed. This is fixed. How junk science is being used against trans kids. All right.
It is the latest fight over transgender rights.
Arkansas passing a bill blocking gender-affirming care for trans youth.
Transgender kids in Texas are facing new barriers to accessing health care.
Right now, you're probably seeing the fight for gender-affirming care for trans kids play out across the country in your news feeds and all over the internet.
In 2022, the power of science and literature crumble in the face of the trans lobby.
We're seeing just sustained kind of moral panic and attack on the very idea of trans people. And so obviously science is being weaponized.
At one point, biologists were allowed to determine what biology was, and there were two, male and female.
But there's one thing that keeps popping up over and over and over again in an attempt to discredit the rights of trans people: junk science. But first, what makes junk science, well, junk? First, you have to understand the role that science has historically played in understanding sex and gender, and how that's being weaponized today.
You can't respond, oh, so men can become women just by wishing it so? Tell us.
I hate this fucking question, okay? I hate this. What is a woman? I fucking hate this, okay? What is a tree? What is a tree? If I ask you that question and you describe a tree, I'm going to be like, that's a carnivorous tree. What are you talking about? That's not what I'm thinking of. That's not a real tree. That's not a biological tree. What if you describe a fruit tree and I'm going to be like, no, trees don't have fruit. What is a tree? Aaron. Yep. I mean, you got it. It can't be any more right than that.
That's how that works.
I talked to Jules Jill Peterson, a science historian and professor at Johns Hopkins, who studied the history of trans children, about the actual history of research that's attempted to define sex and gender.
For a long time, the kind of research on gender, sex, and trans people was incredibly poorly executed. It was often done with outright prejudice. It was often done with very poor methodology. And it was often done in order to kind of increase social control of people, to force them to conform to a gender binary.
Let's rewind back to the 1940s and 1950s, and specifically to the history of the word gender.
The crisis for both physicians and psychologists in the 1950s was that they had no idea what made people male or female. It wasn't chromosomes, it wasn't gonads, right? It wasn't hormonal composition, it wasn't genetics. They couldn't find any one facet of biology that predicted reliably, right, who would be male or female. And then they were encountering all these people whose bodies didn't match how they felt on the inside. As I found when I was reading the medical records, they would assign intersex children a sex, right? And they would enforce surgeries and hormones on them to achieve that sex. But then the child wouldn't identify with that sex, and it would cause so much hardship. And so gender was sort of created just to make a conceptual distinction.
Peterson says the war against trans people actually has a basis in the same tenets that enforce scientific racism historically.
We could talk about a kind of history.
Absolutely, that makes sense. Absolutely. I hadn't thought about it that way, but I could definitely see that connection. And it doesn't surprise me that Scientific American made that connection as well. I see a lot of commonalities there, and I'd like to hear what she has to say about it. So let's continue, shall we?
history of scientific racism that lots of people are familiar with. That was basically sort of projecting social hierarchies, right, out into the world. White Northern European scientists just kept discovering that they were apparently the superior race, right? And you see this sort of shift after World War II away from kinds of biological explanations around race towards sort of cultural explanations that still come to the same conclusions. Interestingly enough, the history of gender in medicine and psychology is actually a really key part of that.
And the thing is, a lot of outdated misinformation about sex, gender, and trans people is still cited today.
But I think sometimes that the line between junk science and legitimate science changes over time. So it's really easy for people to kind of cherry pick ideas that they might want to use sort of out of context. And that's a lot of pressure to put on, someone reading a newspaper article or scrolling Twitter.
And if you want to talk about cherry-picking data, the very same psychologists who tried to enforce biological definitions of sex on kids were same psychologists who accidentally discovered something else.
Just that the idea that gender is separate from sex, as in separate from the body, that they don't always go together. That's a concept that we often take for granted as being either associated with or invented by trans people somehow. It was an invention of behavioral psychologists who were working very closely with researchers in endocrinology in the 1940s and 1950s. But they couldn't force children to then identify as boys or girls. That was their big problem. Team talk about this in a series of papers in 1955 published at Hopkins. They say gender is basically just your sense of being a boy or a girl.
And science has come a long way. It's increasingly understood now that gender isn't a binary. Peterson says there's still a lot of misconceptions masquerading as scientific consensus.
The biggest right is that there is scientific consensus on what makes people male or female, or what makes people trans. The anti-trans side invokes really outdated scientific concepts. The idea that, we know what makes people male or female. It's either genitals or our idea of chromosomes. Anyone worth their salt will tell you XX and XY are not the only chromosomal combinations for humans.
So how and why should we debunk junk science?
Before I even decide if I would want to debunk something, I first just want to contextualize, where did this data come from? Their work may have been past peer review 20 or 30 years ago, but it wouldn't today.
And we don't need to go far to see moral panic.
A 2018 study by a Brown University researcher suggesting that peer pressure could make kids trans led a journal to republish a corrected version.
But that same study is being used against trans kids right now.
So I think actually the tools that we would bring, right, say to debunking race science or other kinds of just extremely unscientific, but also extremely objectionable weaponizations of scientific discourse, I think we can use those same principles. And so if we start from a point of view where we're unafraid to say, like, look, I don't like junk science directed at trans people because it harms trans people and it's bad science, right?
Yeah, that was a really good video. All right, Jordan, I'm actually going to be heading out here soon, so I hope you have a wonderful day as well. Yeah, that was an incredible video. Thank you, Scientific American, for posting that. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I will put a link to the video in the YouTube if anybody would like to go rewatch it or share it with some friends or something like that. Yeah, that was incredible. That was really great. I'm so glad that we watched that. Yeah, it's very true. A lot of this junk science really does harm trans people pretty significantly. And it's not just trans people that are harmed by this. It's all kinds of people. A whole swath of people are harmed by this type of junk science. So I'm hoping that as time goes on, we can see that society will move away from that. But, you know, given the history of society, it seems like we seem to fall into these patterns, these cycles where we end up doing the same thing over and over and over and over again. Yeah, so